This gives us a new perspective on qualia. Qualia is not epiphenomenal. Qualitative experiences are actually adaptive instructions. So they serve to guide the conscious system towards a far from equilibrium state of dynamic equilibrium. I guess you could call it a non-equilibrium equilibrium. An organism tries to maintain itself in this attractor, and a dynamical attractor is applied to life as a state of homeostatic balance. What is pain in this model? It's a high free energy signal indicating dangerous deviation, where pleasant sensations are low free energy signals and basically signal the organism to maintain adaptive behaviors. A signal to keep dynamic equilibrium against this tendency to dissolve. Now that we have an understanding of how the subjective perspective emerges from self-modeling and the function of qualia, let's talk about how we can potentially quantify consciousness, which is what integrated information theory tries to do with their measure phi. And the argument here is that consciousness grows richer with cognitive complexity, specifically with the number of accessible states the system can access. This idea is called repertoire. Entropy, we're talking about the number of states a system can experience. So the average number of states the typical human could experience is far richer than the average number of states of a cat, which is far richer than the average number of states accessible to a mouse. This idea is based on the law of requisite variety. The great cyberneticist Ross Ashby wrote this paper in the 50s. The law says to survive, an organism must have a repertoire of cognitive states and behavioral responses as large as the number of different challenges presented by its environment. So a cat hunting mice must have as many responses as the ways the mouse can evade it. Humans who live in a complex social and technological world, we require an even greater repertoire of responses. So the more options a system has to respond, the more effectively it can control its situation. Francis Heiligen says, since the variety of perturbations a system can potentially be confronted with is unlimited, we should always try to maximize its internal variety so as to be optimally prepared for any foreseeable or unforeseeable contingency. Alex Wisner-Gross at Harvard has this concept of causal entropic forcing, which says that there's this drive to maximize future freedom of action. So life is trying to increase options, it's trying to avoid trapped states. Daniel Polanyi, computational neuroscientist, has this concept of empowerment, which is an agent's capacity to influence its future states. And empowerment is proportional to requisite variety. Why is this all relevant to consciousness? The size of the mental repertoire relates directly to the richness of experience. It's worth quickly mentioning the Red Queen principle is a principle from evolutionary theory that says as competitors evolve, organisms must expand their repertoire to stay viable. So this fuels evolutionary arms races, which act as complexity ratchets. What begins as simple molecular memory in genomes eventually evolves into internal representations in self-aware social agents. Because of the need to complexify, life is always generating new species that have greater requisite variety. Because the social world of modern humans keeps growing more complex, evolution seems to be progressive. There's always a new niche for intelligence willing to take on more complexity. Christoph Koch says the more complex the system, the larger the repertoire of conscious states it can experience. Robin Carhart-Harris, a psychedelics researcher, he says the view taken here is that the human brain exhibits greater entropy than other members of the animal kingdom, which is equivalent to saying the human mind possesses a greater repertoire of potential mental states than lower animals. What does this mean? It means we can potentially measure the information content of a given observation, and we can basically infer that observation works in this same way as observing an outcome with a roll of dice. When you toss a coin and you observe the outcome, you get one bit of information. When you observe a six-sided die toss outcome, you get 2.6 bits of information. So the amount of information scales with the number of possibility. That's a basic principle from Claude Shannon's information theory. And so applying that to consciousness, we are saying that the more possible states a cognitive system can be in, the higher the repertoire entropy. So here entropy is not measuring disorder, but cognitive bandwidth. Information is a reduction in uncertainty. So the amount of information in a signal is the uncertainty reduced upon observation. That leads to the conclusion that the depth of a conscious moment scales with the number of states that could be experienced but are not currently actualized. Repertoire entropy measures this richness. The greater the space of possibilities, the more information in an experience. So the current experience would be defined by the counterfactual cloud that surrounds it. Red's redness emerges from its position within contrast networks, relationships to green, blue, yellow, and the entire perceivable spectrum. We can imagine the simplest organism, for example, a bacterium performing chemotaxis. It basically only has two states. If it senses chemical food, it doesn't move, it doesn't do anything, and then it basically sits and feeds on that food. If it doesn't sense food, it wiggles its tail, and that moves it to some new location until it senses food. So you can imagine a system with just two states where each state is defined only by not being the other. To understand this new picture, there's this dialectical relationship between presence and absence. This binary agent wouldn't be able to perceive color. The two states couldn't be red and blue. The complexity of the experience of color has to emerge from this network of relationships. A system that can only experience two states would only experience something like light and dark. And it might even be misleading to talk about a visual modality because you don't have the complexity for different sensory streams. It's really just presence or absence. It's the spectrum of possible experiences we could have but aren't having that makes the present what it is. The more accessible states, the greater the variety of qualia. As we evolve and learn more and our spectrum of possible experience increases, so should the intensity with which we feel them. The information content of a conscious experience increases in proportion to the size of our mental repertoire. As we learn and as we go through life and travel to different destinations, we're basically unlocking more accessible states. We're increasing the size of our cognitive repertoire, our requisite variety. And this makes me think differently about everything. Like when I'm trying like new food, I'm seeing that as unlocking like new quality and new states. And by doing that and expanding the size of my cognitive repertoire, I should be increasing the richness of each conscious experience because each observation will then be ruling out all of the experiences that I could have had but aren't having at that moment. Repertoire entropy measures the number of adaptive responses available. Integrated information theory's phi, touted as a measure for consciousness, already captures this. Phi is measuring the degree to which a system is more than the sum of its parts, so it's measuring emergence. The larger the repertoire, the larger the potential phi. Phi is a good proxy measure for consciousness because it captures repertoire entropy, but it should be emphasized that integrated information is necessary but not sufficient in this framework. Those strange loop theories says consciousness requires self-modeling in addition to integrated information.
So now you have a reading of the basic mechanics as effectively planning. So there are certain things that can plan and therefore become authentic agents, and certain things that can't. The only thing that differentiates them is how big they are. A single-celled organism would not be able to be an agent, but a multicellular organism would be. I was reading your repertoire entropy. You could also read that in terms of if I had a neuron can be firing or not. If I had two neurons, I've now got 2 to the power 2. If I've got 1 billion neurons, I've now got 2 to the power 9. So the entropy, the number of states that this collective can occupy, just simply increases with the number of components that comprise the system. As the size increases, the probability that part of it is now sequestered from action increases, which means that now you have the opportunity to describe this kind of system as agent in the sense it now has intentions in that it looks as if it is planning into the future.
Michael argues that consciousness emerges with life, and he says that it's even doing some basic kind of self-modeling, which might be true, but it sounds like you're saying that there needs to be a richness of self-modeling to get a perspective, and that it might emerge with brains or maybe even multicellular organisms that don't have brains. Is it brains uniquely, or could it just be a hierarchical, complex adaptive system like a multicellular organism without a nervous system?
I think Mike could argue that it could be any system that had a sufficient structural complexity of the kind that you were talking about. To confirm that, you would have to look for this capacity to model the future, particularly the future of the thing that you are interrogating or studying. There is a particular structure to the brain which recapitulates the cause-effect structure of the world that it is trying to be a good regulator of or a good generative model of. And one aspect of that, of course, is the fact that the actual world in which we live has a scale invariant aspect and has separation of temporal scales that comes installed into your brain. But I think if you find that separation of temporal scales and that sort of deep hierarchical structure within which you can have the strange loops and the metacognitive picture that you were painting, then you have an opportunity for a certain kind of consciousness, but exactly in the way you were describing agency. That could be some elemental consciousness, if it, in a phenomenal sense, has causal power in that it can deploy precision or attention to lower levels. Then you need another level to be aware that you are modeling. And then you need another level to be, to have an explicit self, minimal selfhood, and another level. I can't remember. The top of your level was something. I thought you were going to say it was a philosopher. You had a list of sort of from microbes to through to increasingly. Sort of metacognitive systems with greater and greater hierarchical depth. And I thought at the top or the bottom would be a philosopher.
I should have. Yeah, that would have been a nice conclusion for that. My old professor Harold Moritz would always start with the universe began with atoms, and now we have philosophers that understand atoms, and philosophers are the material world understanding itself. That completes the strange loop. What about higher than brains? I know you and Maxwell have papers on societies as minimizing free energy. Could a society be conscious, or does it not have the Markov blanket needed to have a sort of world modeling, self-modeling system? Could there be conscious entities created from collectives of conscious entities?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and it allows me to reflect back on the importance of intersubjectivity in underwriting the need for self-models in any one member of a society. In your unpacking of different levels of self-modeling, in one slide, referred explicitly to others and self-modeling. If we now go to the sort of second or tertiary level of self-modeling, where I have this hallucination that I am me, and this is the best explanation for all the myriad of things that are going on in my hierarchy, why would I ever need that? From a functionalist or teleological point of view, I would only ever need that, or it would only be ever justified in terms of the complexity cost that attends the free energy principle, if it was necessary to disambiguate the consequences of my action relative to yours. So the argument here is that I was your astronaut on Mars kicking stones that had never been seen before. If that astronaut had been brought up in that environment and never had to experience an other like him, there would be no need for selfhood. There would be no need for that kind of elaborate, deep, complex, metacognitive kind of generative model. We could spend, again, another hour talking about the importance of being part of the society of mind. That enables otherhood before selfhood.
So for that next level of consciousness, you basically need others. You need a mirror to really have a good concept of yourself.
Yeah.